Hi everyone, my name is Fernando Teixeira and I'm a senior instructor at AWS, currently teaching at the AWS Cloud Institute. Today we're going to be looking at AWS API Gateway on a serverless cloud application. In my background today, I have the Taj Mahal, which I visited some 10 years back. It was actually built by an emperor to honor his wife. And considering my wedding anniversary is coming up soon, that puts a little bit of pressure on me. In my series of videos, I'm building a simple trip planning application, so the APIs we're going to be looking at are used for this application. Let's take a quick look at it so we know what we're building. I essentially have a list of trips that I can create. I can then, once I create a trip, I can add an itinerary for it based on preferences that I have, and that itinerary is generated using generative AI, and that gets added to my trip. If you want to see a simple demo of this, I have a video for that, which I'll include in my description. Yeah, this is not a fancy UI, because my goal here is to teach AWS, not web design. And this is the high-level architecture for the application. I do have a video that covers that, but very quickly in a nutshell, on my backend, I have a DynamoDB database to keep track of my data. I have Lambda functions to access, manipulate that. I also use Bedrock over here for that generative AI. On the front end, I deploy the application on an S3 bucket using CloudFront to distribute that. It is a React-based application, and I use Cognito for my security. But the part that we're going to cover today is that API in the middle that's going to be the glue between my UI and the backend functionality. We're going to look now at some of the basics of API Gateway. I should point out though that for the other components in the previous slide, Lambda, DynamoDB, Bedrock, I actually have other videos for that as well, and I will include those in the description. I want to get to the practical examples really soon, but just give you the quick basics. Yeah, API Gateway will give you the ability to create, publish, and maintain secure REST APIs. There are actually two ways to do a REST API on the API Gateway. Originally, AWS had this one here called REST API, and that one has a lot of features. It supports API keys, it has local caching, it lets you do transformations and request validation, but it is a little higher cost. So at one point in time, customers started asking AWS, hey, can you give us just a simpler version for a simple proxy in front of a Lambda function or another endpoint? And then they created the HTTP API. So it's a lower cost, but more basic features, limited API management, but it still works very well. And in fact, I'm going to be using that one because since this is a beginner type class, I figure a beginner is more likely to use the cheaper version. So I'm going to be showing you the HTTP API. But before I implement my API, I need to design my API. And I'm going to do that by looking at the client operations that my application needs to support. So I need to be able to create itineraries. I need to be able to create and retrieve trips. I need to be able to search for trips by user and date. And I need to be able to put an itinerary on an existing trip. Now, in my previous videos, I've already created the implementation on the Lambda functions that are going to do that. So yes, I have a Lambda function to create an itinerary using Bedrock. I have functions to add and retrieve trips to a DynamoDB database. And then I have the functions to list the trips for user and for user by date. And finally, I do have a function that is going to add an itinerary to an existing trip. Now I just need that glue in the middle, and that's my API. So I'm going to be using a REST API. I'm not going to get into a lot of philosophical details on REST APIs here, but a REST API generally is based on resources having operations performed on them. So in my case, I'm going to have an itinerary resource, and that's going to have a post method that is going to add that itinerary. I'm going to have trips resources, and then I'm going to have post and get methods to again add and get a trip. And then I'm going to have a subpath underneath that for trips by user ID and dates, and again, the corresponding get methods lining up with the Lambda functions. And finally, I'm going to have trips with the itinerary subpath that is going to be able to post an itinerary on an existing trip. Now, it's worth noting that this is just one possible design for this API. Other people might choose, to have a different structure for the resources and methods, and that's okay. As long as you're consistent, you're not doing anything wild, that's fine. And also, I should say that in the real world, I would probably be doing this specification on a tool that uses a standard format like OpenAPI, because then the cool thing is that I can import that directly into API Gateway. But over here, we're going to be doing things manually so you can see all the different pieces. So we're going to look at that HTTP API hands-on right now. But remember that the Lambda functions I'm integrating with and the DynamoDB database design that I'm going to use are covered in other videos. So I'm going to show them here and there as it relates to the API, but I'm not going to be covering them in detail here. Okay, so here we are at the API Gateway console. I'm going to go straight to create an API. And you see over here the different API types that I talked about, HTTP API and the REST API. Yes, you also see the WebSockets API, but that's not for REST, so we're not going to be using that. Let me click on Build over here. And let's give it a nice name, Trip Planner. That sounds good. And I'm going to go straight to Review and Create, because I want to get the API created in one shot. And then I'm going to go and start adding my integration. So I create. And now I have an API created over here. Now we start creating our resources. And remember, I have all of my Lambda functions over here. And I have my DynamoDB database over here that already has some data. And I'm going to be using those in my APIs. So, okay, so let's start with the trips resource. I'm going to go over here and do a create. When I create a resource, particularly the first time, they're going to ask me to actually put already one of the methods. So I'm going to do the get method over here. And I'm going to create the resource. And that already created a get method over here. So I'm going to also add here on the trips. Oops, I'm going to add an other route. On the trips, I'm going to create the post. So let's do the get and the post together. And now I get the trips with the get and the post. I could create all the other ones underneath, but let's start doing some integration so we can do some early testing. So for the get, I'm going to attach an integration. Now, by the way, notice this attach authorization over here. Let me give you a disclaimer right off the bat. There is a lot of authorizations that I can add to my API, and I should for production one. This is not something I'll be covering in this video because honestly, there will be a whole separate session on all the different types of authorization. So this is going to be a public API. That's not the ideal case in most situations, but I'm not teaching the details of API security in this one basic session. So let's attach an integration to our get. So I create and attach one. It's going to be a Lambda type of integration, but you can see all the different ways that I can integrate my API with different services and even HTTP endpoints out there. But we're doing Lambda. So it is going to look for Lambda functions that I already have in my system. So remember in our little PowerPoint slide before, the one that is going to get a trip, I do have a trip get API. Sorry, trip get Lambda function, and that's the one I'm going to integrate with. This little toggle over here means that API Gateway is going to do me the favor of going out there to the Lambda function and making sure it sets the resource policies needed for me to be able to call it. And I'm going to create this, and boom, I got an integration done. You can already see the little symbol over here, and you can see the integration. Let's do the same thing for the post. So on the post, I'm going to create and attach that integration. So let's do once again a Lambda function. And the function for that one is trip add. Scroll down, create, and now I got my get and my post for my trips. Okay, so let's look now at the routes that include my path variables. All right, so I'm going to go over here and I'm going to create under my trips. I'm going to create another route. I'm on the integrations. Let me go back to routes over here. And the trips, I'm going to create another route. And that's going to be trips. And then I'm going to put that path variable over here for the user ID because I want to specialize the trips per user ID. So for that, and that's going to be a get because I'm going to be retrieving the trips for a user. And I'm going to create that. Let's complete that. Before I even do that, underneath the user ID one over here, I'm going to create another path. It always takes me back over here to the, close those. Right, now I can create a route. Let me go over here, create the route. And let me do now trips. user ID and dates. So that's gonna give me the user IDs and the dates within that. So I'm gonna create, oh, almost forgot my method. It's a get. Okay, so that should have all of the paths that I need. So now let me then put integrations again. And by the way, if you see me kind of clicking and selecting, it's because in the other API flavor, the REST API, one of the API gateway, you generally select the route and then you kind of build on top of it. But in this one, every time you do a create, you have to enter the full path anyways. So if I click on this get method, I'm going to attach my integration here. So I need the method that is going to get the trips for users. So I have created and attach an integration. And yes, I do have a Lambda function for that. So let's go to Lambda. And I'm going to be doing a trip list. So trip list is going to give me the trip list by user. Create that. And then let me go to the other one over here. I actually can go straight to create and attach an integration. Save me a little time. That's going to be once again the Lambda function. But this one is a trip list by date. It's a different Lambda function. All right. So all of those Lambda functions, by the way, I have them up here in case we need to look at them. So that's one. That's my regular trip list. That's my trip list by date. But we're going to finish creating all of our resource and all of our methods first. And then we're going to go a little bit into the, the testing and as needed look at the Lambda function. Okay, so I'm missing now just the itinerary ones. So I'm going to create, actually I haven't created the one that actually creates the itinerary, but just so I can finish the whole trips hierarchy over here, I'm going to create the one that adds an itinerary to a trip first. So let me go back over here to my routes, and I'm going to create another route where I'm going to do and in this case, this is to add an itinerary to a trip. So it's going to be a post because I'm inserting something. So it's going to be under trips. I have an itinerary, trips itinerary operation. So I'm going to create that. Great. Then I'm going to click over here. Expand. I have to scroll down. So I'm going to click on the post and I'm going to attach that integration, create and attach. I'm going faster now because we've seen this before a few times. Lambda function. And for this one is going to be a trip add itinerary. There you go. This one over here. And I'm going to create. And the last one that I need to do, let me go back to my routes, is the one that actually creates an itinerary. So create. Because the create, I'm going to be doing a post over here, and that's plain old itinerary. So I will create that. I will again click on my method, attach integration, create and attach integration, Lambda, and this one is going to be trip there it is, trip itinerary. All right. So I have my entire structure over here created, all of my functions, all of my integrations. Well, the next thing you need to do is start testing this stuff. Now, when it comes to testing, I gotta tell you, this is one place where the fancier REST API version will give you a little more because I can actually test an API locally without even deploying. But in the plainer, simpler HTTP API, I actually have to use an external tool. And by the way, I mentioned deploy. You might say, well, Fernando, you haven't even deployed this API. Well, I could click deploy over here and deploy my own version with a specific name. But with the HTTP API, there is actually a default deployment that happens when you start playing with it. So there's already a default development version of it. And particularly for the purpose of the testing, yeah, that's pretty good. So if I click over here, you can also get some information on this top over here by clicking on that. That gives you the overall view of the API and all of my deployment stages. I can get this URL, and that's my default, particularly for testing, URL that I can use for testing. So I will need an external tool. And in this demo, I'm going to be using Postman, which is a very popular tool. and I'm gonna send different test requests to that default API deployment that already happened for me to do some quick development test. Now, unfortunately, folks, I can't teach you how to use Postman. There are, in fact, a number of tools out there, so that doesn't really matter. But you're gonna see me using, so I'm gonna start testing. Let's do the trips first. I'm gonna select over here the new trip method. Now, I already created all of those before, the sort of the wireframe for the different calls that I'm gonna make. And I'm gonna enter that URL that I took out of that default stage. But for trips, I'm gonna need to add a trips over here because that was our resource. This is a post method. Now over here in the post method, in this particular tool, again, every tool is going to have its own way of passing things. On the body, I need to pass the information about my trip. Again, I mentioned a little earlier, this format, this structure is something that I explained when I gave the lecture on DynamoDB earlier. So I'm gonna have my dog Moose going. He went to Korea before. So let's see, where can Moose go now? Oh, so maybe a little bit in the middle of the year, in June, Moose is gonna go to, where can he go? Let's send Moose to Rio de Janeiro, where I grew up. So now I'm gonna send that post request to that URL that we just created, and let's see if that works. But before we go there, I actually need to make sure I look at my database to find out that I don't have this data already, otherwise I might be cheating. So over here in my database, that's the database that I used in the previous video. I'm gonna refresh so we can get the latest and greatest. Yeah, if you look at Moose over here, Moose already has that trip to Korea, but he doesn't have a trip to Rio de Janeiro. Finn has a couple trips to Rio, but not Moose. All right, so let's see if that works. Let me go back over here to my Postman and let's send that request. Okay, it said in the response that the data was inserted into DynamoDB successfully. That's what my Lambda function returned. Well, one way you can verify that, let's actually go to the database. And in the database, I can actually refresh and see, yep, there's my trip to Rio. So my API worked. Of course, the job of inserting that into the database, yeah, it's in one of the functions. In this one over here, it wasn't the trip add. That's the one that had the code to insert. That's the one that was called when I did that integration before. Okay, let's look at another one now. I'm not gonna do the simple get again. So I just did that post for the trips. Let's do a get now, but let's do a complicated one. I just go straight to the most complicated one because I'm not gonna there's way too many requests to test over here. So I'm gonna do the get by user ID and dates because I wanna show you how do we pass that information? How do we pass the user ID and whatever date range I'm specifying over here? So that's one that I'm gonna do. So let's go. So that one integrates to my list trips by dates function. Let's go to Postman right now. And yes, I have over here the list trips by date. Now I have a previous test that I did with a different API. So I'm going to replace that with the API that we're using right now. I'm going to now, let's do the one that we just inserted. Let's do Moose. So Moose has a couple trips in there. And then we put the from date. And let's do, I guess from this time into, I guess, the end of next year. So let's take a look at this. I am passing Moose over here. So I replace where over here in the API, there was this little placeholder for user ID in the path. Yeah, on the actual call that gets replaced with a real name. And then I'm using a query string to pass a date range. Now, why is it? Well, that's because that's how I defined it. So if I go to the Lambda function with the trip list by date, you can see for this one here, I do retrieve, let me go to the Lambda handler here, my from date and my to dates, I'm getting as a query string. So I wrote the function, I designed this, I know that the from date and to date are gonna be query strings. However, the user that I'm querying for, that's gonna be coming out of a path parameter. So when you're using API Gateway with Lambda, yes, you need to know where the attribute in the event is coming from. If it's a query string attribute, it's gonna come out of query string parameters. If it's one of those path attributes, path variables, it's gonna come out of path parameters. And I can do a combination. In fact, in this case, I have a combination. The user ID is gonna be coming out of the path parameter, and then the query string is gonna give me the from date and the to date. And yeah, once I have all of the data, then I'm gonna do my database query. I already covered that in the previous session. So let's just look at the API. going back to the API. Do I already have everything I needed over here? Yes, I have the user moose over here, and I have the date. So let's go ahead, let's rock and roll. Let's send this. And yeah, it looks like it came back. So this is a trip we just added to Rio over here, Rio de Janeiro. And the previous trip they had done before to Korea. And then yes, you get some other metadata that comes in the request. But you can see that the data came back from the database correctly. All right, let's just do one more. Let's do a fun one. Let's actually do the AI one. Let's create an itinerary. So if I go over here to the API Gateway, I can see that I have an itinerary path over here. You may notice that I have 2 itinerary paths. Well, that's because I have a creation of the itinerary as a standalone thing, because I can create multiple itineraries until I see one that I like. And then there's a path for itinerary under trips. And that's when I add that itinerary that I like to the trip. So we're going to just create one. So we're going to be doing this one over here, this post that's in this. That's going to match up to this trip itinerary Lambda function over here. Let's go. I'm going to go to my Postman over here. Yeah, I have a placeholder over here from a previous test. We do want to use our URL for our current request, then itinerary, and then it's a post. See what I have over here. So this is a previous trip to Iceland. Okay, that's actually not bad. I'll keep Iceland, although I have to do that next year because I actually did a trip to Iceland. So in fact, that was my inspiration for doing this. Let's do, as a guideline, 2 activities per day. What do I like to see? Nature. I like to see waterfalls, and puffins. Gotta see some puffins in Iceland because actually I didn't see them when I went there. It was a crying shame. All right, so again, this is the syntax that my Lambda function is expecting. So that's what I'm putting on my task because it's gonna get passed through by API Gateway. So let's send. And here we are. I can actually make this thing look a little nicer by switching just to JSON. And you can view the itinerary that I generated. The golden circle too, that's very nice. Yeah. Some hot springs. Waterfalls. So many beautiful waterfalls out there. Some food. Yeah, looks like I got a nice old Diamond Beach. That was also very cool. So yeah, and then I would actually take, the UI would take this itinerary and make that other call over here to actually add that itinerary to the trip that I selected. And that's how the game is played, folks. I have all of my APIs, my UI calls them, and then my UIs can kind of wire them together. And that's it for today. I didn't test every single method because that would take way too long, but I think you got the idea. And there are, of course, a lot more features that I didn't cover, particularly if I had shown you the REST API version. Those are definitely worth looking up if you end up creating an API for a real application. So as the viral influencers say, click like and subscribe. See ya.